Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
I was sitting in the middle of a long business trip, exhausted from endless meetings and late-night dinners with people I barely cared about, when my phone buzzed and I saw my mom's name flashing on the screen, and for some reason, even before I picked it up, I knew it wasn't going to be good news, because nothing coming from her mouth ever came without a string attached or a comment designed to cut me down. I answered anyway, because no matter how many years of disappointment she had managed to stack up, she was still my mom, and some small, stupid part of me always hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would surprise me with something warm or supportive. Instead, she started speaking in that casual, almost bored voice of hers, the one she used when she wanted to sound like the queen of control, and she said, "Your money's gone, your stepsister is worth it, you're not." For a second, I couldn't even process it, because I thought I had misheard, or maybe she was drunk, or maybe this was some twisted attempt at a joke, but then she repeated herself, slower this time, as if I were a child who needed her words spelled out. And that was when my stomach dropped and I felt the room tilt. She didn't yell, she didn't argue, she didn't even justify it in detail. She just stated it like she was announcing the weather, like it was a done deal, and I had no right to even ask questions. I remember my hand tightening on the phone so hard I thought it might snap, and instead of screaming or demanding answers, something in me froze completely, and the only words that came out of my mouth were, "Thanks for the update." Then I hung up. You would think that after a call like that I would break down crying or go on a rampage, but the truth is, I just sat there in the hotel room, staring at the stupid patterned carpet, completely hollow, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to laugh or throw up. This was money I had saved for years, money I had built up with discipline and sacrifice, money I thought was mine. And she had managed to reach in and drain it away, as if I was nothing more than a line item on her list of resources to redirect to her golden child, my stepsister Chloe. It wasn't even that I didn't see it coming, because favoritism had been the rhythm of my childhood, but the sheer brazenness of it, the way she dismissed me as if I were worthless, that was something new. I kept hearing her words over and over, "Your stepsister is worth it, you're not," and the more they echoed in my head, the less they felt like a financial theft and the more they felt like a lifetime of judgment wrapped up into one final sentence. It was her way of putting into plain language what she had always implied, that Chloe mattered, and I was disposable. She had just never been so blunt about it. And the fact that she thought she could get away with saying that, and leaving me to swallow it in silence, told me everything I needed to know about how little she thought of me. I didn't call her back, I didn't text her, I didn't even mention it to anyone from work who was sitting across from me later that night, clinking glasses and talking about budgets, because if I had tried to explain it to them, they would have looked at me like I was crazy. Who does that? What kind of mother calls her daughter on a Tuesday evening just to tell her that she's not worth the money she earned? But she did, and the shocking part was I wasn't even surprised, hurt, yes, but not surprised. That's the thing about years of being treated as second best. The betrayal shocks your system, but the truth of it feels almost familiar. As the days on that trip dragged on, I thought about all the little moments that led up to this. The times when Chloe got the praise for doing the bare minimum while I was expected to move mountains. The times when my mom defended Chloe's laziness as just needing support while criticizing my independence as cold or selfish. I realized that call wasn't really about money, not to her. It was about putting me back in my place. She wanted me to hear it, absorb it, and accept it, and maybe even come crawling back with a broken voice, begging for her approval. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have predicted, was that my silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. The more I sat with those words, the clearer it became to me that something inside me had shifted. I wasn't going to shout, I wasn't going to cry, and I wasn't going to waste my energy trying to win a game that had been rigged against me since childhood. Instead, I started to think in a way that scared even me, because for the first time I didn't just want fairness, I wanted to turn the tables. I wanted her to feel the same casual dismissal, the same gut punch indifference that she had delivered to me without hesitation. When I flew home at the end of that week, I didn't storm into her house or demand explanations. I carried myself as if nothing had happened, smiling politely, answering her texts with bland little replies, and acting exactly the way she expected a defeated daughter to act. But underneath, there was a cold fire running through me, a plan forming in pieces, because while she thought she had stripped me of what mattered, she had no idea that she had just handed me the key to destroying the one thing she valued most. And as I unpacked my suitcase and set my work laptop on the desk, I whispered to myself the same words I had told her on the phone, but with a new edge. "Thanks for the update." And in that moment, I knew she had no idea what was coming. When I got back from that business trip and returned to the rhythm of work, emails, and daily routines, the call with my mom kept replaying in my head, not in fragments, but in full sentences, almost like a recording stuck on repeat. And it forced me to go back through the years of my life, pulling apart the patterns that I had tried so hard to ignore. I had always known that Chloe was the one who mattered in my mom's eyes, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just favoritism in the ordinary sense, the kind that most siblings complain about when they say one child gets away with more. Because in our family it had been systematic, it had been built into every decision, every holiday, every dollar that moved from one hand to another, and every conversation where I was told to be the bigger person while Chloe was painted as fragile, special, or deserving of endless support. I started remembering birthdays where mine would come and go with maybe a card or a half-hearted phone call, while Chloe's would be celebrated like a national holiday, complete with dinners, gifts, and long speeches about how much potential she had. I thought about the time I worked 2 jobs to save up for college textbooks, and when I mentioned it to my mom, she barely nodded, yet when Chloe dropped out of community college because she needed a break, my mom spun it into some kind of noble decision about mental health and resilience, and everyone around her nodded along like she was a hero. And then there were the times money came into play. The most glaring of all, my mom had once told me to keep a tight budget because you never know when life will test you, but whenever Chloe overspent or racked up debt, there was always some excuse and then some bailout, with my mom shaking her head in mock frustration, but always writing the check anyway. Sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through endless spreadsheets from work, I couldn't help but start calculating in my head, not the numbers in front of me, but the years of help Chloe had received compared to the sacrifices I had made. If I added it all up, if I treated it like one of the balance sheets I handled at the office, the equation would be laughable. Chloe had cost thousands upon thousands, while I had been told repeatedly that independence meant not asking for anything, and yet, somehow, I was still being cast as the selfish one. And now, apparently, my savings had been redirected into her future, as though everything I had built was nothing more than raw material for Chloe's next chapter. The anger simmered, but it wasn't just anger, it was a kind of quiet recognition, like I was finally seeing the blueprint of my family laid bare. This wasn't an isolated betrayal. It was the final stage of a long-standing pattern, and my mom had delivered it to me with the casual cruelty of someone who assumed I would never push back. That thought kept me awake at night, and it made me realize that if I wanted to understand what had really happened with my money, I needed to dig deeper. I started going through old paperwork, tax forms, and bank statements I had saved, things I normally would have thrown away, but for some reason I had kept, maybe out of habit, maybe out of instinct. And then one evening, after hours of digging, I came across something that stopped me cold. It wasn't a clear smoking gun yet, but it was enough to make my heart pound. It was a document that hinted at something beyond just my savings being drained. It suggested that property, something tied to my father's name, had quietly shifted ownership, and the beneficiary wasn't me, it was Chloe. I stared at the page so long my eyes started to blur, and I realized this wasn't just my mom being reckless or cruel in the moment. This was calculated, this was planned, and it had been happening quietly behind my back for who knows how long. In that moment, all the memories of my dad came rushing back, the way he had worked himself to exhaustion to make sure there would be something left for me, the way he had once said, "At least you'll always have some security when you're older," and now. Staring at this piece of paper, I felt sick to my stomach wondering if that promise had been erased without me even knowing it. My mom had always brushed off questions about Dad's estate, saying it was complicated or that I didn't need to worry, and I had let it go because I was young and trusting, but now I realized that her secrecy hadn't been protection. It had been manipulation. I didn't call her, I didn't confront her, and I didn't mention it to anyone, not even friends who would have told me to lawyer up immediately, because something inside me told me to stay silent for now. If I went storming in, yelling about betrayal, she would just spin it the way she always did, make me sound ungrateful, make Chloe sound helpless, and make herself sound like the martyr who had sacrificed everything for her children. Instead, I started rehearsing a new role, the quiet, obedient daughter who had finally accepted her fate, the one who would keep answering calls politely and smiling through conversations while I pieced together the truth. And as I slid that paper back into the folder and tucked it away, my chest tight with a mix of rage and clarity, I realized that my mom thought she had already won, that she had crushed me into silence with one cruel sentence. What she didn't know is that she had only just lit the fuse, and while she was busy bragging about Chloe's new opportunities, I was already calculating how to dismantle everything she valued most. The paper I had found sat on my kitchen table like a dare, and once I had taken a breath and steadied myself enough to trust my own eyes, I did what anyone who works with deadlines and documentation does when something smells off, which is to go straight to the place where records don't care about family stories or pretty versions of the past, and I pulled the county recorder site, searched my father's name, and watched a string of filings roll up that read like a slow, careful erasure of every promise he ever made me, starting with a transfer on death deed that had looked harmless years ago when we all nodded along to something a notary explained in words I didn't fully understand, and ending with a quiet amendment to a small living trust that reworked beneficiaries in just the right order for the house that had paid off his life to bypass me altogether and fall into Chloe's hands, as if gravity itself had changed direction while I was busy working and paying my own bills. I scrolled and clicked and read paragraphs written in that bland legal tone that never breaks, and I could see the dates lining up with memories I had not connected at the time. Like the week my dad was in and out of the hospital and my mom had insisted she would handle everything because she was the one who had the patience for paperwork. Or the afternoon she had snapped at me for asking where documents were kept and told me I didn't need to know because it would all be simple later, and I remember feeling embarrassed for pushing, which now feels ridiculous, because there in black and white were signatures witnessed by one of her friends and a notary I had never heard of. And the result was that the one asset my dad used to soften his voice when he talked about my future had been redirected with surgical precision to the daughter my mom could never stop protecting from the consequences of her choices. The reality of it didn't land like a single blow. It landed like a series of small hits that worked their way through muscle and into bone, because alongside the deeds were the bank pieces. The friendly little joint account that had been marketed to us when I was young as a way to help me build savings with a better rate and an extra layer of security, which in practice meant that my mom's name sat next to mine like a key left under the mat. And when I called to ask about the transfers, the woman at the bank explained in that patient customer service voice that accounts titled that way belong equally to both parties, so a cashier's check moving the balance to Chloe for education and family expenses was not considered unauthorized, and that phrase, education and family expenses, burned more than the missing balance, because it was the same moral cover my mom had used my entire life to justify taking from me and giving to Chloe under the banner of love, as though investment in one child could only be funded by subtraction from the other. I did not argue with the bank, because that would have been yelling at a wall, and I did not call my mom either, because confronting her without a plan would have handed her the stage she always craved. The one where she plays the misunderstood caregiver while I am cast as the cold, ungrateful daughter, so instead I called my Aunt Diane, who has never liked drama, but who loved my dad in a way that still shows up in her voice. And I asked her the kind of question that makes relatives go quiet, which was whether she had ever seen my mom push him into signing something when he was too tired to read it. And after a long pause, she said she had seen my mom bring stacks of papers to the kitchen table and say things like, "Just initial here and we'll sort the details later," and she had thought it seemed fast, but had trusted that they knew what they were doing. And while I don't blame her, Hearing it confirmed what the filings already screamed, which is that the map of my future had been redrawn in my absence by someone who relished the power of the pen. So I did the things I could do that did not require her permission or even her knowledge, practical moves that cut off pathways she had been using for years, beginning with freezing my credit so no one could open anything in my name while smiling about family, then closing every account she could plausibly touch and reopening them where her name has never existed. And because I work in a world where paper beats noise, I ordered certified copies of every deed and amendment, not to wave in her face, but to stack in a folder that a lawyer would actually take seriously. And while that was happening, I took a deeper breath and made the first small strike that felt like justice rather than protection, because I learned that a church committee, one my mom practically treats like a personal publicity arm, was drafting a little profile about Chloe's bright new venture and the generous family support behind it, and all I had to do was send the committee chair a calm, anonymous packet with bank printouts and a line that said the seed money came from a co-owned account that the other owner did not consent to share, along with the dates and the transfer memo my mom had been clumsy enough to leave intact. And within 2 days the profile disappeared from the bulletin draft, and the chair sent a polite email to my mom asking for clarification on the origin of funds before they published anything. The call from my mom came right on schedule, her voice tight but coated with sugar, asking if I had heard about some confusion at church and whether I knew anything about a misunderstanding with donations. And I kept my tone steady and told her I had been busy with work and hoped it got sorted out, and when she pushed, I reminded her that she had made it crystal clear I was not worth investment. So surely she would not want me involved in clearing up her version of generosity, and I let the silence sit just long enough for her to hear how different I sounded before I wished her luck and hung up, because what she did not know, and what I would not tell her yet, was that the church note was only the first thread of a larger sweater I planned to pull. And the next person to ask questions would not be a committee chair with polite phrasing, but someone who writes letters on letterhead that make people rethink their stories overnight. I woke up the morning after that church bulletin quietly vanished and realized that for the first time in my life I had moved a piece on the board without announcing it, and the sky had not fallen. Nobody had rushed in to accuse me of being ungrateful, and my mother had been forced to make calls she did not want to make, which told me I had finally found the tone that works in a family like mine, a tone that avoids screaming and instead relies on paper, timing, and the kind of questions that make confident people stumble. So I made coffee, opened a blank document, and started listing what my mother cared about in order of how loudly she would defend it, and at the top, above money and even above Chloe, sat her image. The picture she paints of herself for church ladies, neighborhood friends, and anyone who will listen long enough to hear the story where she is the backbone of a good family doing good things. With that in mind, I sent a short message to my contact list asking for a recommendation for a quiet estate attorney who is allergic to drama and obsessed with filings, and within an hour my friend Nora, who manages vendor relationships at my office and has a Rolodex that could fix a city, replied with the name of a woman who used to clerk in probate and now handles ugly family situations with a tone so calm it makes people confess. And after one call in which I laid out the joint account transfers, the timeline on the deeds, and the names of the notary and witnesses, she told me that while the joint account would be a hard fight, the title story had a seam. Because if a transfer on death deed or a trust amendment was executed while a signer was medicated or under undue pressure, or if promise notices were never sent to the named beneficiary, then there was room to open the file. And if there was room to open the file, there was room to record a notice that would make title companies back away until questions were answered. She did not promise miracles, she promised process, and for once that was exactly what I wanted. So I emailed scans, dropped off certified copies, signed an engagement letter that did not require me to sell an organ, and sat with her while she drafted a simple demand for documents that sounded both polite and lethal, asking my mother to provide the full set of estate papers, proof of notices, and an explanation for date gaps that lined up a little too neatly with hospital records. And before she sent it, she explained the second document, the one that would travel to the county, the one that does not accuse anyone of a crime, but simply announces that a rightful heir disputes a transfer and intends to be heard. Which is the kind of line that freezes a refinance or a sale in its tracks and forces a person like my mother to realize that power on paper moves faster than gossip. While the lawyer prepared the filings, I worked on the social side of the equation with the same quiet intensity, not by ranting on social media or calling cousins to stir the pot, but by asking for receipts in places where my mother had claimed saintly credit. Because I knew that when people who love their reputation hear the word receipts, their stomachs twist, so I wrote to the church treasurer and asked, using my most pleasant corporate tone, whether the donation acknowledgement letters for last year could be reissued with the last 4 digits of the funding account masked on each line, because I was trying to reconcile records for tax purposes and had been told by my preparer that this would help. And I copied the committee chair who had pulled Chloe's profile so that the request landed in a room where everyone already sensed smoke, and within a day I had letters with redacted account numbers that were not mine, which let me forward them to my attorney with a single sentence. About representations made to a religious institution that seemed to rely on mischaracterized funds. It felt almost ridiculous that something this simple could rattle a woman who has spent her entire adult life performing confidence, but the calls started anyway. First from my mother pretending to check on my week and sliding into questions about whether I had been talking to anyone from church. Then from Chloe using that labored whisper she reserves for crises to ask if I could just be kind and stay out of it, because the stress was making her feel sick, and I responded in the same flat voice I used with difficult vendors, saying that if they had everything in order, the questions would answer themselves, and if they did not, it was better to know now than later. Which is a very gentle way of saying you made this bed, and I am finally letting you lie in it. The revenge in this chapter was not a dramatic confrontation or a shouting match in a living room. It was a signature on a document that my attorney walked to the recorder's office before lunch, a short, clean notice that says a transfer is disputed and that anyone who wants to rely on it does so at their own risk. And while I went back to work and finished a presentation that had nothing to do with any of this, my mother, who had planned to quietly pull equity from that house to bankroll Chloe's next miracle, discovered that a lender who had smiled at her last week would not touch her file now, that the title company she adores because they always bring pastries to closings had flagged the parcel with a red note, and that the neat little plan to show up at church with a new grant for Chloe's venture tied with a bow had been replaced by a stack of questions that start with when and end with why. Late that evening, after I had finally put my laptop away and promised myself I would stop thinking about any of it for 1 hour, my phone buzzed with an unknown number that turned out to be a realtor who works with half the neighborhood and knows every coffee group my mother holds court in, asking in a tone that tried to sound casual whether I was aware of a cloud on title and if there was anything she could do to help smooth things over for the family. I thanked her for her concern and said I was following counsel and could not discuss it, and as I ended the call I saw another message arrive from my attorney, short and surgical, saying that the demand for documents had been delivered, receipt confirmed, response due in 10 days. And almost at the same moment my mother's name lit up my screen, calling in a frenzy, because for the first time in her carefully curated life, the doors that always opened for her had stayed shut, and she had no idea that the next door to close would be the one she guards most. By the time the deadline on my attorney's letter crept close and the cloud on title had done its quiet work of turning polite smiles into cold delays, I had already accepted that my mother would not suddenly find a conscience hidden in a drawer or wake up humbled by the mess she had made, which meant the only way to end this was to pull the last prop out from under the performance she had been staging for years. And that prop was not money or property or even Chloe's next bailout. It was the approval she collected like trophies from church committees, neighborhood groups, and every person who ever heard her talk about sacrifice and family values. So I spent one late night drafting the cleanest, least emotional summary of the transfers, the mismatched dates, and the representations made to the church about donations, and I sent it, not as a blast or a rant, but as a quiet, documented packet to 3 places that actually moved the needle in her world: the senior pastor and the small circle of lay leaders who sign off on anything public, the regional office that oversees our congregation when questions about governance and finances come up, and the treasurer whose hands were already shaking from having to pull Chloe's glowing profile the week before. I did not accuse anyone of crimes or write a speech about morality. I attached statements, deeds, and timelines, and I asked two questions that leaders never want on paper, which were whether the church would be comfortable publishing profiles or public thanks based on funds drawn from a co-owned account without the other owner's consent, and whether it would be wise to postpone any new public acknowledgement of family gifts until a simple third-party review could confirm that no misrepresentation had occurred. And then, because I knew image was the heartbeat of my mother's power, I made a separate move that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with taking away her microphone, which was to call the pastor directly and offer to underwrite the modest scholarship my father used to daydream about in his quiet way, a small, practical award for a local student in his name that would require clear receipts, independent accounting, and a written policy that barred any committee member with a personal tie to a recipient from participating in decisions or public communications. And when the pastor asked if I had any conditions beyond clean books, I said I had only one, which was that the public announcement would honor my father and the student and would not carry the narrative of anyone else's generosity. The next week unfolded like the slow turn of a lock, not dramatic from the outside, but unmistakable if you knew the sound. Because the church sent out a bulletin that included the scholarship announcement with my father's name and a short line about anonymous funding and transparent criteria, and what did not appear, what had always appeared before in some form, was my mother's name or voice or any hint that she had paved the way, and the leadership note at the bottom, written in bland but careful language, said that the church was reviewing its recognition process to ensure accuracy and to avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest, and that phrase, which many people would skip without thought, landed like a hammer in the small circle where my mother had built her identity, because it told every person who had ever listened to her stories that something had been off, and that the adults in the room were fixing it without asking her permission. My phone lit up again with messages that pretended to be concern but were really reconnaissance, and I kept repeating the same steady line about following counsel and wishing everyone well, while my attorney pinged me with the update that my mother's response to the document demand had arrived late and thin, heavy on attitude and light on substance, and that we would proceed with the next letter that does not raise its voice yet somehow makes people stop breathing for a moment. And while that legal train kept moving at its careful pace, the social train arrived with the speed I had expected, because the church called my mother into a meeting to discuss her recent communications. The treasurer requested updated donor acknowledgments with account verification language. The regional office suggested a rotation of committee roles that would remove her from the positions she treats like a personal stage, and the small circle of neighbors who host fundraisers in their living rooms quietly shifted the upcoming event to another house with a line about simplifying logistics. I did not show up to any of those rooms, I did not gloat, and I did not send a victory text. I went to work, I paid my bills, and I let the structure I had set in motion do what structures do when they are well built, which is to keep standing while the old facade cracks. And when my mother finally called me from her car, voice brittle and full of rehearsed indignation, accusing me of trying to ruin her life and of turning people against her, I told her in one long, even breath that I had not ruined anything, that I had simply told the truth to the people who had been asked to publish her version of events, that I had funded something in my father's name with my own money under rules that valued accuracy over performance, and that I had no intention of chasing the house or clawing back the savings, because I did not need them to feel whole. I only needed the story to stop being written over me. She tried every move I knew by heart, tears that sounded like theater, flattery delivered too late, warnings that families who air their issues end up alone, and I let each one land and pass, because the point of this was not revenge for its own sake. It was to end the game in a way that could not be reversed by charm, and that meant I had to stay calm while she realized what had actually been taken, which was not cash or keys or heirlooms. It was the thing she guarded more than any of that, the narrative that she controlled every room and every introduction and every thank you note, and now, for the first time in her life, people she counted on to nod were asking for receipts and timelines and someone else's signature. I wish I could say that she apologized or that Chloe called to make it right, but what actually happened was quieter and, in its own way, more final, because the questions kept coming from people who used to clap. The committee's closed ranks around new policies that did not include her. The house stayed stuck in a gray zone she could not charm her way out of. And the scholarship in my father's name went to a kid who shook my hand and wrote a thank you note addressed to the man who had inspired it rather than to the woman who had tried to take credit for every good thing. And as I read that note alone at my kitchen table, I felt something unclench in my chest that I had been carrying since childhood. Not triumph that sparkles and fades, but the steady relief of knowing I had ended a long, ugly loop without screaming or begging. So when people ask, usually in softer voices than they used to, whether I got my money back or whether the house will ever be mine, I tell them the truth that matters to me, which is that I took the only thing that ever held power over me in that family, and I set it down where it could not be used again. And if there is still paperwork to finish and conversations that will never be had, that is fine. Because the final move was never about a transfer or a check, it was about taking back the story, and she learned it the next week when her calls stopped being returned and her seat at the table went to someone who does not confuse generosity with control. And for the first time since I was a kid, I did not feel like a guest in my own life.